Hi everyone, this is Sandy, and I'm going to talk to you today about meningitis. Let's start by defining the term meningitis. It's an inflammation of the meninges and the most common sequela to microbial invasion of the central nervous system. A sequela is a pathological condition resulting from a prior disease, injury, or attack. So in this case, the meningitis is what resulted from the attack by a foreign agent. Though there are many forms of meningitis, I'm going to focus on viral and bacterial meningitis for this presentation. Other forms can include fungal meningitis, which comes from breathing in fungal spores, parasitic meningitis, also known as eosinophilic meningitis, which can be caused by tapeworm infection of the brain or cerebral malaria, amoebic meningitis, typically caused by swimming in infected waters, and non-infectious meningitis, which can come from an autoimmune disease such as lupus. Other causes of meningitis could come from chemical reactions, drug allergies, and some types of cancer and inflammatory diseases. I'd like to do a quick review of what the meninges are before we move on to what happens during the course of meningitis. The meninges consist of 3 protective tissue layers that surround and support the brain and spinal cord. The first is the dura mater, which is composed of 2 layers, one that adheres to the periosteum of the skull and one that adheres to the surface of the brain, and these layers protect the soft tissues of the brain. The arachnoid mater is thin and delicate with arachnoid space below. Strands of collagenous connective tissues, called trabeculae, extend from the arachnoid mater down to the pia mater, forming the subarachnoid space, where the cerebral spinal fluid flows. The pia mater covers every sulcus and goes into every gyrus, making a subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and pia mater varied in distribution. The trabeculae meshing these 2 layers makes them difficult to differentiate from each other, and often these 2 layers are referred to as the leptomeninges. And the leptomeninges is where the actual inflammation occurs during meningitis. The meninges help maintain the shape and position of nervous tissue during movement and directs blood flow to the brain and skull. As I said previously, I'm going to focus on bacterial and viral meningitis for this presentation. Bacterial meningitis is the most deadly, whereas viral meningitis is the most common. They share many common symptoms, with the most important being that they are both contagious, though bacterial meningitis is far more contagious than viral meningitis. We will go into the signs and symptoms in a few slides, but I did want to point out that bacterial meningitis is fatal if not treated quickly. The most common bacteria responsible for bacterial meningitis is Streptococcus pneumoniae, followed by Neisseria meningitidis, with other common bacteria being Listeria monocytogenes and Haemophilus influenza type B. Even with treatment, as many as 20 to 50% will die, and those who recover from bacterial meningitis can have lifelong complications. Viral meningitis, on the other hand, will typically resolve without treatment, though going to the hospital is still advised as soon as you notice symptoms. Some people will feel effects more than others, such as infants and immunocompromised people. And common viruses that lead to meningitis include the enteroviruses, which are the most common, and several other viruses that I have listed on this slide. So the etiology of bacterial meningitis is where bacteria reaches the CNS via the bloodstream, cranial structures where CSF can leak into sinus cavities, or possibly wounds that penetrate the dura mater, like a skull fracture or certain types of neurosurgery. Streptococcus pneumoniae is the bacterium most commonly involved in meningitis in adults, whereas Haemophilus influenza type B meningitis has a falling incidence due to the availability of HIB vaccines. 30 to 50% of survivors will continue to have neurological deficits. The etiology of viral meningitis is caused by viruses present in the body that find their way into the bloodstream and brain, or in a retrograde manner from nerve endings. How a virus reaches the meninges through the nerve ending is by either infecting the nerve ending tissue or the cells of the bloodstream that will then carry the virus through the blood-brain barrier. Viral etiology varies according to age groups and geographical location, and it's also seasonal in incidence, where you'll see higher cases in the summer to early autumn. Close contact with someone with viral meningitis may lead to infection of the original virus, but does not necessarily develop into meningitis. As mentioned earlier, the signs and symptoms of viral and bacterial meningitis in adults and children are similar and can include a high fever, chills, headache, sensitivity to light, neck stiffness and muscle pain, nausea or vomiting, extreme tiredness, and a rash whose appearance depends on the virus or bacteria causing the meningitis. The most common rashes are caused by Neisseria meningitidis and may resemble bruising with areas of reddish or purple discoloration. Non-blanching rashes indicate severity of meningitis. So if you press a glass on a rash and it does not disappear or change in appearance, it is non-blanching. In addition to shared symptoms, bacterial meningitis may also cause limb pain, pale skin, cold hands and feet, altered mental state such as confusion, seizures, especially in children, and tachycardia. In babies and newborns, bacterial or viral meningitis can cause high fever, constant crying, excessive sleepiness, irritability, especially due to the fact that babies cannot communicate where and how much pain they're in, a high-pitched cry, poor feeding, vomiting, bulging of the anterior fontanelle, excessive arching of the back and stiffness of body and neck, and death. So who is at risk of meningitis? Meningitis is a major global public health challenge. It can occur anywhere in the world, but there are areas with higher incidence, such as sub-Saharan Africa, also known as the African meningitis belt. Risk is also higher in conditions of close quarters, such as refugee camps, military settings, and overcrowded housing, including college dorms. There are higher risks for the immunocompromised, heavy alcohol users, and smokers. Different age groups are more at risk for different types of meningitis, as listed on this slide, with children and adolescents at more risk due to behaviors that are high risk, such as living in close proximity to each other, like in those college dorms, sharing drinks or eating utensils, and not being properly vaccinated against meningitis. Looking at the anatomy involved in meningitis, because bacterial meningitis affects the CSF, there are various structures of the body affected, such as the central nervous system, the circulatory system, the musculoskeletal system, and the integumentary system. Viral meningitis does not affect the CNS to the same degree that bacterial meningitis does, because the immune system intervenes. And in viral meningitis, the brain parenchyma is spared. And what the brain parenchyma is it's functional tissue of the brain that consists of neurons and glial cells. Its function is to transmit messages back and forth between the sensory organs and the brain and CNS. So sparing of the parenchyma in viral meningitis is why you don't see the same systemic effects as you do with bacterial meningitis. Looking at the pathology of bacterial meningitis, earlier I listed ways bacteria can enter the CSF to cause meningitis, and once the bacteria is in the CSF, it multiplies without immediate detection by the body. This is because the white blood cell count in the CSF is so sparse. So there is no initial inflammatory response to the bacterial presence. The growing bacteria will eventually stimulate the release of the inflammatory response to cause swelling. Bacteria also consumes available glucose, which depletes the levels in the CSF, and that's what damages the brain parenchyma. Complications can include hydrocephalus, arterial or venous infarct due to inflammation, abducens palsy, deafness, subdural empyema, which is the pus between dura mater and the arachnoid mater, a brain abscess or herniation, and systemic complications such as septic shock. The pathology of viral meningitis begins with the entry of the virus to cause the infection. Secondary infection of the CNS is what causes the meningitis through infection of the choroid plexus epithelium, infection of the lymphoid tissue, inflammation and blood-brain barrier breakdown, infection of peripheral sensory neural pathways, or that strong inflammatory immune response. Cases often go undiagnosed due to poor understanding of viral meningitis. Looking at methods of diagnosis, so someone who comes in for medical service with symptoms of meningitis will be treated as if it was bacterial in nature because of the life-threatening course. The gold standard to diagnose meningitis is through analysis of the CSF from a lumbar puncture. Blood cultures are also taken. There are some cases where the lumbar puncture is delayed, such as if there is increased intracranial pressure or an intracranial mass. In these cases, a CT or MRI are performed prior to lumbar puncture to ensure safety in doing the procedure. Doing a lumbar puncture will drop the CSF pressure at the puncture site, and the resulting pressure gradient may result in cerebral herniation. Despite the delay in the puncture, treatment of bacterial meningitis is begun immediately, and the CSF analysis will only confirm the diagnosis. A positive CSF result will show increased white blood cell count, elevated protein, low CSF to blood glucose ratio, increased pressure, a positive gram stain, positive culture, which is bacteria growing in the sample, and detection of bacterial DNA. They can also use physical signs such as the Brzezinski sign or the Kernick sign. And the Brzezinski sign is where stiffness in the neck will cause the knee and the hip to flex when the neck is also flexed. The Kernick sign is where there may be severe pain in the thigh when trying to extend the legs from a flexed position. Even though these are classic signs, this is not a highly reliable diagnostic tool for meningitis. For viral meningitis, in addition to the same tests that are done for bacterial meningitis, there's also the polymerase chain reaction of the CSF, which will detect and quantify viral DNA or RNA. Bacterial meningitis can be ruled out if no bacteria grows from the CSF cultures, but that result can take a few days, which is why they start treatment immediately as they wait for this result. Looking at the effects on structure, in the central nervous system, you'll typically see swelling of the brain and spinal cord, which will cause headache, memory and concentration issues, ringing in the ears, light sensitivity, loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, poor coordination, and if left untreated, it can lead to a coma. In the circulatory system, septicemia from bacteria in the bloodstream. There will be bleeding under the skin that will look like a mild rash at first. Blood pressure will fall and the circulation will slow, which will lead to blood vessel damage. There could be deterioration of the lungs and kidneys, and there is a higher amputation risk of fingers, toes, arms, and legs. In the integumentary system, the skin may look flushed. The septicemia can make the skin look blotchy, and worsening infection will cause a spread of the rash, resembling large bruises across the body. In the skeletal and muscular systems, you'll see a stiff neck and back that can become painfully rigid and arched, joint stiffness that can lead to arthritis, muscle weakness, muscle spasms, generalized weakness, and in infants, that tight or bulging fontanelle. So during the course of meningitis, the effect on all the systems will cause effects throughout function. But even after recovery, there may be lingering effects such as memory loss, lack of concentration, difficulty retaining information, clumsiness, headaches, deafness or hearing problems, epilepsy or seizures, weakness, paralysis, muscle spasms, speech problems, loss of sight or vision problems, and being easily fatigued. So looking at treatment of bacterial meningitis can produce good outcomes if the treatment is provided quickly and appropriately. Supportive care can include IV antibacterial drug therapy specific to the bacteria, corticosteroids, and management of complications. Patients should be on respiratory isolation during the first 24 hours to prevent spread, and vaccines may prevent certain types of bacterial meningitis. As stated earlier, treating viral meningitis as if it were bacterial will occur until you get an actual confirmed viral meningitis diagnosis. And at that time, you'll be treated with supportive measures such as antipyretics to help with fever, analgesics, antiretroviral drugs, etc. Vaccines can also help with prevention here as well. So prognosis for bacterial meningitis is concerning. Even with treatment, mortality rate is significant. This chart here I found, even though it's dated 2006, shows a nice spread of how the age groups are impacted across the different types of meningitis, with the over 65-year-old group the most impacted by death. Without treatment, bacterial meningitis will result in death, whereas viral meningitis typically resolves with or without treatment within weeks or sometimes months. Here are some of my references, and thank you for listening to this presentation. I look forward to your questions.